I don't need a second chance. I just need someone who won't leave when things get inconvenient. The words weren't loud, weren't angry, and somehow that made them impossible to ignore as Daniel Carter stood still in the middle of the polished marble lobby, his worn sneakers out of place among tailored suits and clicking heels, while across from him, Olivia Hayes, CEO of Hayes Global Holdings, paused mid-step as if something invisible had just struck her chest. Her assistant still talking beside her, but fading into background noise as Daniel's sentence lingered in the air longer than it should have, longer than anything that simple had a right to. And for a brief second, something flickered in Olivia's expression before she quickly masked it, turning slightly as if to regain control. But the disruption had already happened, because this wasn't how her morning was supposed to go. Not on the day of the biggest acquisition meeting of the quarter, not in front of her entire executive floor, and definitely not because of a man she had almost walked past without noticing, a man holding the hand of a small boy clutching a faded backpack with one broken zipper, the kind of detail Olivia had trained herself not to see anymore, the kind of detail Daniel had stopped apologizing for years ago. Yet here they were, two completely different worlds colliding in a space that usually erased people like him. And as the elevator doors behind Olivia opened with a soft chime, she didn't move immediately, something inside her hesitating just long enough to feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, like a memory she didn't ask to revisit. While Daniel adjusted his grip on his son's shoulder, his face calm, almost detached, as if he hadn't just said something that cut straight through the silence of a billion-dollar building. And the boy looked up at him with quiet trust, unaware of the shift he had just caused, unaware that his father's simple sentence had just unsettled a woman who hadn't been shaken in years. And Olivia finally stepped into the elevator, but just before the doors closed, she glanced back, not fully, just enough to see Daniel guiding his son toward the security desk, and for reasons she couldn't explain, her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with control, and everything to do with something she thought she had buried long ago, while upstairs, her boardroom filled with executives waiting for her signature decision, unaware that the real decision had already begun forming downstairs, quietly, unexpectedly, and dangerously close to changing everything. Olivia didn't hear the first question her CFO asked when she entered the boardroom, because that one sentence was still echoing in her head with a clarity that didn't belong in a room built for numbers and strategy, and she took her seat at the head of the long glass table a second too late, forcing a quick apology that felt foreign on her tongue as she straightened the stack of reports in front of her, her movements precise but just slightly off rhythm, the kind of detail no one else would notice but her. While across town, Daniel Carter signed his name on a clipboard at the front desk, his handwriting steady despite the way his son, Noah, tugged gently at his sleeve, asking in a quiet voice if they were late, and Daniel shook his head, kneeling down to zip the broken backpack a little higher so it wouldn't slip again, telling him they were right on time even though he knew they weren't, because being on time had stopped being something he could always control a long time ago. And as they waited for the school coordinator to arrive, Daniel's mind drifted briefly, not to regret, not anymore, but to calculation, rent due in 11 days, gas tank just under a quarter, the extra shift he might be able to pick up if Mrs. Alvarez agreed to watch Noah overnight. All of it running quietly beneath the surface while his face stayed calm, almost unreadable, the same calm that had carried him through job interviews that went nowhere and conversations that ended too quickly. While back in the boardroom, Olivia finally focused on the presentation in front of her, a merger that would expand Hayes Global into 3 new states, projected revenue increases flashing across the screen, her team waiting for her usual sharp questions, her decisive tone, but instead she paused longer than expected, her pen hovering over the paper as a different question formed in her mind, one that didn't belong in this room, one that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share, and without meaning to, she asked, what happens to the employees we replace? And the room shifted instantly, a subtle ripple of confusion passing between executives who had worked with her for years and had never heard her ask that first, never seen her prioritize people before numbers, and her COO answered carefully, explaining severance packages, transition support, the usual structured response, but it felt insufficient even as he spoke, and Olivia nodded. Though her attention had already drifted again, back to the lobby, back to a man who didn't raise his voice yet. Somehow said more than anyone in this room ever did, and she exhaled slowly, forcing herself back into the present, reminding herself that decisions like this defined her, built everything she had, protected everything she had fought for. Yet for the first time in a long while, that certainty didn't land the same way, didn't settle as cleanly in her chest. And as the meeting continued, Olivia signed off on smaller approvals automatically, her signature moving across documents with practiced ease. But when the final contract was placed in front of her, the one that would finalize the merger, her hand stopped, just for a moment, long enough for silence to stretch across the room, long enough for her assistant to glance at her with quiet concern, and in that pause, she saw again the boy with the broken backpack and the man who refused to ask for anything more than someone who wouldn't leave, and something inside her shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to make her realize that whatever decision she made next wasn't going to be as simple as it had always been. And downstairs, completely unaware, Daniel sat beside Noah in a narrow office chair, waiting for someone to call their name, unaware that somewhere above him, a woman he didn't know was already beginning to hesitate in a way that could change both their lives. By the time Daniel heard his name called, the waiting room had filled with the quiet restlessness of parents checking their phones and kids shifting in their seats. But he stood up immediately, placing a steady hand on Noah's shoulder as they followed the coordinator down a narrow hallway lined with faded posters about attendance and opportunity, the kind of words that sounded hopeful but felt distant when you were already behind. And Noah walked a little closer to him now, his earlier curiosity replaced by something quieter, something more cautious. While Daniel kept his expression even, offering a small reassuring nod when the boy glanced up at him. The same nod he had used 100 times before to say everything he didn't have the luxury to explain, and as they stepped into a small office, the coordinator smiled politely, flipping through a folder with their names on it, explaining the transfer process, the limited availability, the importance of consistency. Each sentence carefully neutral, professionally distant, until she paused briefly at a section in the file, and her tone shifted just slightly, asking about Noah's previous absences, and Daniel answered without hesitation, his voice calm, factual, leaving out the parts that didn't fit neatly into paperwork, the nights he worked late, the mornings when transportation fell through, the times life simply didn't cooperate, and the coordinator nodded, typing notes. But her expression told him what he already knew, that understanding didn't always translate into opportunity. While miles away, Olivia finally dismissed the boardroom, her team filing out with measured conversations about projections and timelines. But she remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the unsigned contract in front of her as the silence settled heavier than usual. And when her assistant stepped back in to remind her of her next appointment, Olivia closed the folder without signing it. A small action that immediately shifted the day's entire schedule, and she stood, grabbing her coat. Instead of another report, ignoring the subtle surprise in her assistant's eyes as she said she needed 10 minutes, though she didn't explain why, because she didn't fully understand it herself, only that something about that man downstairs hadn't left her alone, hadn't fit into the controlled structure she relied on, and as she walked back toward the elevator, her pace slightly faster than usual. She told herself it was just curiosity, just a distraction before making a major decision, but the truth felt less convenient, less controlled, and when the elevator doors opened again to the lobby, the space looked the same but felt different, quieter somehow, as her eyes instinctively searched for him. And across the room, Daniel stepped out of the office with Noah beside him, the conversation clearly over, the outcome not needing explanation, and for a second he paused, scanning the room as if recalibrating his next move, before guiding his son toward the exit, his posture unchanged but something heavier sitting beneath it, something final. And Olivia saw it, recognized it in a way she couldn't ignore. The moment someone decides to keep moving forward without expecting anything to change, and before she could stop herself, she took a step in his direction, then another, the distance between them closing just enough to make the moment real, just enough to make turning back feel like a choice. And as Daniel reached for the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle, Olivia's voice finally broke the space between them, not loud, not commanding, but certain enough to make him pause. And for the first time that day, Their paths didn't just cross. They stopped. Daniel didn't turn immediately when he heard her voice, not because he didn't recognize that someone was calling him, but because he had learned over time that most interruptions didn't change anything. They only delayed what was already decided, and for a brief second his hand stayed on the door handle, as if weighing whether this was worth stopping for, while Noah looked up at him, then back at Olivia, sensing the shift without understanding it, and only when Olivia took another step closer did Daniel finally turn, his expression neutral, steady, the same quiet control he had held on to all morning still intact. And up close the contrast between them felt even sharper, her tailored coat, her composed posture, everything about her signaling authority and certainty, while he stood there with a life that didn't leave room for either, and yet neither of them spoke right away, the silence stretching just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable, real, and Olivia realized she hadn't planned what to say, hadn't even decided why she stopped him. Only that letting him walk out felt wrong in a way she couldn't justify. So instead of a polished question or a controlled statement, what came out was simpler, almost abrupt. "What did you mean earlier?" And Daniel studied her for a second, not defensive, not impressed, just measuring the intent behind the question, as if deciding whether honesty would matter here. And Noah shifted slightly beside him, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack, grounding him in the present, and Daniel finally answered, his voice calm, unchanged, "Exactly what I said." And Olivia exhaled softly, a flicker of frustration crossing her face before she caught it, because she wasn't used to answers that didn't move toward her, didn't adjust to her expectations, and for the first time in a long time, she felt slightly off balance in a conversation. While behind them the lobby continued its quiet rhythm, people passing by, phones ringing, the world moving forward without noticing that something subtle but important was happening in the middle of it. And Olivia tried again, this time more carefully, asking why he said it, what situation he was talking about, but Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't offer a long explanation, and when he spoke, it was still simple, still controlled, because people don't leave when things are hard. They leave when it stops being convenient. And this time the words landed differently, heavier, pulling something from Olivia that she hadn't intended to give, because for a split second, her mind didn't go to business or strategy. It went somewhere personal, somewhere she had spent years building distance from, and she looked away briefly, collecting herself, but the shift had already happened, because what she heard wasn't just a statement, it was a mirror, and Daniel noticed it, not in a dramatic way, but in the small change in her posture, the way her shoulders lost just a fraction of their certainty, and he didn't press it, didn't follow up, because that wasn't who he was, and after a moment he nodded once, as if closing the conversation on his end, turning slightly back toward the door, ready to leave again, ready to continue the day exactly as it had already been set. But this time Olivia reacted faster, stepping forward just enough to stop the moment from ending. And before she could overthink it, before she could return to the version of herself that didn't hesitate, she asked a question that surprised even her, one that didn't belong to her usual world of controlled outcomes. What happened in there? And for the first time, Daniel hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because answering meant letting her see something real, something he usually kept contained, and the pause between them shifted again, deeper now, more personal, and neither of them fully realized that this was the moment where the story began to turn, not because of what had already been said, but because of what he might say next. Daniel let out a slow breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to mark the shift before he answered, his eyes briefly dropping to Noah, who stood quietly beside him, watching the exchange with a kind of patience no kid should have to learn this early. And Daniel placed a gentle hand on his shoulder before looking back at Olivia, his voice still even. They said there's no spot for him, and the simplicity of it made it land harder than any long explanation could have, because there was no anger in it, no attempt to argue or convince, just a statement that had already settled into something final. And Olivia felt it immediately, the weight of a decision made in a small office that would ripple through a child's life in ways no spreadsheet could measure. And she opened her mouth slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out right away, because this wasn't a problem she could solve with a signature or a strategy, at least not in the way she was used to. And Daniel continued before she could ask, not defensive, not seeking sympathy, just finishing what she had started. They said attendance matters, stability matters. He gave a small nod, almost acknowledging the logic of it, and they're not wrong. And that was what unsettled Olivia the most. Not the rejection itself, but the fact that he wasn't fighting it, wasn't trying to push back, as if he had already learned where pushing stopped working. And Noah shifted again, looking up at his father, quietly asking, "So I stay at the old school?" And Daniel crouched slightly to meet his eye level, his tone soft but steady. "Yeah, for now." And Noah nodded, accepting it with a small, controlled expression that felt far older than his age. And something inside Olivia tightened again, sharper this time, because she recognized that look, the early understanding that disappointment doesn't always come with a solution. And as Daniel stood back up, he gave Olivia a brief, polite nod, the kind you give when a conversation is over, when there's nothing left to gain from staying. And he reached for the door again, this time without hesitation, but Olivia moved before he could open it, stepping into his path just enough to interrupt without touching him, her voice firmer now, less uncertain. "Wait." And both Daniel and Noah looked at her, and for a second she felt the full weight of their attention in a way that no boardroom had ever made her feel, because this wasn't about authority, this was about responsibility, and she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the old instinct to stay detached pulling against something newer, something less controlled, and then she made a choice, not fully formed, not fully understood, but real enough to act on. "How far is his current school?" she asked, and Daniel blinked once, clearly not expecting that question, before answering. "About 30 minutes, on a good day." And Olivia nodded slowly, processing, recalculating in a way that had nothing to do with business metrics. And she glanced at Noah again, at the worn backpack, at the quiet way he stood without complaining, and something shifted more clearly now, something that felt less like curiosity and more like involvement. And she looked back at Daniel, holding his gaze this time. "And your work?" And Daniel gave a small, almost humorless breath, 45 the other direction. And that was it. No complaint, no elaboration, just the reality laid out in simple distances and time. And Olivia absorbed it. The mismatch, the strain, the invisible pressure of trying to hold two directions at once. And for the first time that day, her next decision didn't feel like an option. It felt like a line she was about to cross. And as the lobby noise continued around them, unchanged, unnoticed, Olivia Hayes stood there on the edge of doing something she normally wouldn't, something that didn't fit into policy or planning. And Daniel, watching her carefully now, realized that whatever she was about to say next might not be small, and that made him hesitate too, just enough to stay. Olivia didn't speak right away, and that silence stretched long enough for Daniel to feel the familiar instinct to step back, to disengage before expectations had a chance to form, because he had learned that when people hesitated like this, it usually meant they were about to offer something temporary, something that sounded helpful but didn't last. And he didn't want that. Not for himself, and definitely not for Noah. So he shifted slightly, preparing to end the conversation, but Olivia's voice came just before he could move, steadier now, more certain than before. "There's a foundation tied to this building," she said, her tone professional, but carrying something underneath it that wasn't part of her usual script. "We fund education programs, placement flexibility, cases that don't fit the standard criteria." And Daniel's expression didn't change much, but his eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in careful evaluation, as if weighing whether this was real or just another version of a door that looked open but wasn't. And Olivia noticed it, felt it, and for the first time she didn't try to override it with authority. She clarified instead, "I don't run that division directly, but I can make a call." And that was the moment something shifted, not outwardly dramatic, but internally decisive, because she realized she wasn't just explaining an option, she was stepping into it, choosing involvement where she usually maintained distance. And Daniel glanced down at Noah again, who was watching both of them now, quiet but alert, picking up on the change without fully understanding it. And Daniel asked the only question that mattered to him, his voice still calm, still controlled. "And then what?" And Olivia paused, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood what he was really asking. Not about process, not about paperwork, but about consistency, about whether this was something that would hold or something that would disappear once it became inconvenient. and for a brief second, she felt the weight of that expectation settle on her, heavier than any business deal she had signed that morning, and she answered honestly, without softening it. Then he gets a spot. If they approve it, and I follow through. And Daniel held her gaze, searching for something in her tone, something that told him whether this was different, whether she meant it beyond this moment. And the lobby noise seemed to fade slightly as that quiet evaluation unfolded. And then Noah spoke, softly but clearly. Does that mean I can come here? And both adults looked at him, and Olivia felt something tighten in her chest again, because the question was simple, hopeful in a way that didn't protect itself, and she nodded once, meeting his eyes. It means we'll try to make that happen. And Daniel exhaled slowly, not relief, not yet, but a shift, a small crack in the wall he had built around expectations, and he straightened slightly, looking back at Olivia with a different kind of attention. Now, not distant, not dismissive, but cautious in a new way, because this was no longer just a passing interaction. This was a line being crossed, and he knew that lines like this didn't come without consequences, and Olivia knew it too, because as she reached for her phone, already dialing a number she rarely used personally, she was aware that this decision, small as it might look from the outside, was about to connect her to something she had spent years keeping separate from her life. And as the call began to ring, neither of them stepped away, both understanding in their own way that whatever happened next wasn't just about a school placement anymore. It was about whether something real could actually hold once it started. The phone rang longer than Olivia expected, each second stretching the moment thinner as Daniel stood still beside her, his posture steady, but his attention sharper now, no longer detached, no longer ready to walk away, because this had crossed into something that could actually matter. And when the call finally connected, Olivia's tone shifted instantly into something precise and controlled, the version of her that made decisions without hesitation, but underneath it there was something else. Now, something more urgent, as she asked for the director of the foundation program, bypassing the usual layers with a quiet authority that didn't need to raise its volume. And while she waited to be transferred, Noah stepped a little closer to Daniel, whispering something too soft for Olivia to hear, and Daniel nodded once, his hand briefly tightening on his son's shoulder, grounding both of them in the moment. And then Olivia began speaking again, outlining the situation in clear, efficient terms, a placement issue, a capacity exception, a child who didn't fit the system but deserved a second look. And at first it sounded like any other request she had probably made before, but then her voice changed, just slightly, enough to reveal that this wasn't routine. No, I want this reviewed today, she said, more firmly now, and there was a pause on the other end, the kind that meant resistance, policy, limits. And Olivia listened, her expression tightening as she absorbed the response, nodding once even though the person couldn't see her, and when she spoke again, it wasn't the polished executive tone anymore. It was something more personal, more direct. I understand the criteria, but I'm asking you to look beyond it. And Daniel watched her carefully, something unfamiliar building in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in situations like this, because he knew how quickly it could collapse. And as Olivia listened again, her composure started to shift, not outwardly dramatic, but in the way her breathing slowed, the way her free hand tightened slightly at her side. And then she said something that made Daniel's attention lock fully onto her. Because if we only help when it's easy, then what are we actually doing? And the words hung there, heavier than anything she had said before, because they weren't just directed at the person on the phone, they were directed somewhere deeper, somewhere inside herself. And for a moment the lobby noise seemed to fade again as the conversation reached a point where logic alone wasn't enough, and Olivia's voice lowered, steadier but carrying something close to strain now. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for a decision that actually means something. And then she stopped speaking, listening, waiting, and the silence that followed felt longer than it was, stretching across all three of them as they stood there suspended between possibility and the familiar outcome of no. And Daniel felt it then, the edge of something breaking, not in the situation, but in himself, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't preparing for disappointment. He was waiting for an answer, and that shift alone was enough to unsettle him. And when Olivia finally pulled the phone slightly away from her ear, her eyes lowering for just a second before she looked back up at Daniel. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, something unguarded, something dangerously close to personal, and she didn't speak right away, which told him more than words could have. And in that brief, quiet moment, both of them realized that whatever came next wasn't just going to affect a school placement. It was going to hit something much deeper, something neither of them had planned to confront today. Olivia lowered the phone slowly, her fingers still wrapped around it, as if letting go too quickly would make the moment disappear. And for a second, she didn't look at Daniel or Noah. Her gaze fixed somewhere just past them, steady but distant, the kind of look that comes when something internal finally shifts beyond control. And when she did lift her eyes, there was no corporate composure left to hide behind, only a quiet, exposed honesty that felt almost unfamiliar on her face. "They said no," she said, her voice calm but thinner now, like something underneath it had started to crack. And Daniel absorbed it without reaction at first, just a small nod, the kind that meant he had expected it all along. And that was what made it land differently, because there was no surprise in him, no visible disappointment, just a quiet acceptance that settled back into place too easily. And Noah looked between them, confused but trying to read the outcome from their expressions, and Daniel crouched slightly again, keeping his voice soft. "It's okay," he told him. And that was the moment something in Olivia broke, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that had clearly been building long before this lobby, long before this call, because she watched him say those two words with a calm that didn't belong to the situation. And she realized he wasn't just comforting his son, he was teaching him how to expect less, how to accept doors closing without question. And something in her chest tightened sharply, almost painfully, and she took a step forward without thinking, her voice catching slightly before she could steady it. "It's not okay," she said, more firmly this time, and both Daniel and Noah looked at her again, surprised by the shift, and Olivia exhaled, her control slipping in small, visible ways now, her shoulders no longer perfectly set, her breathing uneven as she shook her head once. "It shouldn't be this hard just to stay." And the words weren't directed at them anymore. They were directed at something deeper, something she had ignored for years, and Daniel watched her carefully, his expression changing for the first time, not fully open, but no longer distant either, because what he was seeing wasn't authority or obligation. It was something real, something unfiltered, and Olivia's grip on the phone tightened again before she suddenly moved, stepping past them, already dialing another number with a kind of urgency that didn't belong to her usual controlled world. And Daniel turned slightly, following her movement with his eyes. Unsure now, uncertain in a way that made him stay instead of leave. And as the call connected, Olivia didn't wait, her voice breaking through whatever resistance she was met with, stronger, more emotional now. "Then override it," she said, her composure finally cracking as the words came faster, less measured. "If the system can't make room for one kid, then the system is broken." And there it was, the line she crossed without pulling back, the moment where this stopped being a professional request and became something personal, something she was no longer willing to step away from. And Daniel felt it fully now, the shift from possibility to action, from distance to involvement. And he took a small step forward without realizing it, as if drawn into the gravity of what was happening, while Noah stood quietly between them, holding on to a moment he didn't fully understand but would remember. And Olivia's voice, unsteady but determined, filled the space again as she pushed forward, refusing to let the answer stay no. And for the first time, the outcome didn't feel fixed. It felt like it was being fought for in real time, and neither of them knew yet how far she was willing to go, only that she wasn't stopping here. The second call didn't take long, but it felt like everything was balancing on it as Olivia stood there, no longer trying to hide the tremor in her voice, no longer filtering herself into something more acceptable. And when the person on the other end finally responded, she didn't interrupt, didn't push immediately, she just listened, her eyes fixed somewhere ahead as if holding herself together long enough to hear it through. And then something changed, subtle but undeniable, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, her breathing slowing as the resistance on the other end began to soften. And when she spoke again, it was quieter now, but more certain than anything she had said all day. "Thank you." And she lowered the phone, her hand lingering at her side for a second before she looked back at Daniel and Noah. And this time there was no distance left, no barrier of title or control. Just a woman standing in the middle of a moment she had chosen not to walk away from. "They're opening a spot," she said, her voice steady but warm. And Noah's eyes widened instantly, the shift in him immediate and unfiltered. "Really?" he asked, stepping forward without hesitation, and Olivia nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through as she met his gaze. "Yeah, really." And Daniel didn't move right away, didn't speak, because something inside him had gone completely still, like he didn't trust the moment enough to step into it yet. And Olivia noticed the hesitation, the weight of everything he had learned not to expect, and for a second, neither of them said anything. The noise of the lobby returning around them as life continued. But inside that small space between them, something much quieter settled, something real, and then Daniel finally exhaled, a breath that carried more than relief, more than gratitude, something deeper, something that had been held back for a long time. And he looked at her, really looked this time, not measuring, not guarding, just present. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low, steady. And Olivia shook her head gently, her eyes softening in a way that surprised even her. "I know," she replied, and for a brief second, everything slowed, the moment stretching just enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something built from honesty instead of expectation. And Noah, unable to hold it in any longer, reached for Daniel's hand, his excitement breaking through the quiet control he had shown all morning. And Daniel squeezed it back, grounding himself in what was now real, what had actually changed. And as Olivia watched them, something inside her shifted fully into place, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but certain, like a decision she hadn't known she was ready to make until now. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like control, it felt like clarity. And she glanced briefly toward the elevators, toward the boardroom waiting upstairs, the unsigned contract still sitting where she had left it, and then back at Daniel, at Noah, at the life she had just stepped into, even if only for a moment. And she knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a different way of choosing, a different way of staying. And as Daniel gave her a small nod, one that carried more meaning than words could hold, the moment settled into something quiet but lasting. Because sometimes it isn't the biggest decisions that change everything. It's the ones that make you stop walking away. So if you were in her place, would you have made the same choice? And if you've ever had a moment like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay for the next story that might feel a little too real to ignore.